A young man woke up and realized that he had died due to an accident. Before him appeared an angel who intended to reincarnate him into another world. The young man's name was Ryou. Since he was not required to complete any mission, Ryou only hoped to live a new life peacefully. The world where Ryou was reborn was known as P, a world of magic where about 20% of the population could use magic. The element that suited him was the water element. Michael placed Ryou in a forest called Rondo and also provided a small house complete with food supplies for 2 months. The house was also protected by a barrier magic to be safe from monsters. Ryou soon realized that he could read the writings in that world. Although it felt strange, he tried to release water magic from his hands by imagining a circle of water. However, his control was still imperfect. When he tried to make hot water for bathing, his attempt failed. Ryou then switched to trying to make fire in the traditional way. But after several attempts, he gave up because he couldn't light even a single piece of wood. In exhaustion, an idea came to his mind. He imagined compressing water while removing its heat, then connecting the oxygen and hydrogen atoms between molecules. Slowly, the water froze and turned into ice glass that could not melt. Sunlight reflecting off the surface of the glass then focused and burned the wood until fire appeared. That way, Ryou was finally able to enjoy a warm bath. Afterwards, he began thinking about how to preserve his food supplies. He realized that hunting was the only way, so he practiced controlling his magic. At first, his attacks were too weak, even unable to destroy the target. He then tried to narrow the water output and imagined a thin, high-speed jet. Although the first attempt failed, Ryou did not give up and continued sharpening his imagination and magic control. That night, he managed to reverse the ice formation process, heating the water until he could bathe again. The next day, Ryou continued his practice. He tried to collect water vapor from the air and then freeze it. He also tried various other forms of water magic. Because he was too busy practicing, he forgot to light a fire while the sun was still high. As a result, the night felt colder than usual. In the following days, Ryou kept practicing until he was skilled enough to hunt and protect himself in the forest. He started by searching for magnesium stones to make fire, then gathering various herbs for poison antidotes. But suddenly, a wild boar chased him. Ryou froze in fear. In that moment, he remembered his death from being hit by a vehicle. The boar's attack was so strong it could topple a large tree. Ryou's life seemed to hang by a thread again, but this time he dared. Ryou froze the ground in front of the boar, making it slip, then pierced it with a sharp ice magic he formed. After surviving, he returned and studied the beginner edition of the Monster Compendium. From there, he learned that wild boars were actually the weakest monsters. Meanwhile, the strongest creatures in that world were Nage and demons, not fallen angels. That day, Ryou went hunting for food again. But unfortunately, a giant bird suddenly attacked him. The bird was an assassin hawk, the king of killer hawks with the wind element. Its claws and beak were as sharp as knives. Moreover, it could unleash magic in the form of deadly wind slashes. Ryou tried to fight back. He shot ice, but the bird skillfully dodged and grabbed Ryou with incredible speed. In a desperate situation, Ryou created a mound of ice in front of him. Then, the bird collided hard into it, injuring its eye. Feeling that his opponent was too strong, the king of killer hawks eventually retreated. Ryou immediately fell to the ground, gasping but relieved for surviving the deadly threat. Unfortunately, as night fell, he was dragged through the forest after continuously dodging the bird's attacks. Unexpectedly, he witnessed a terrifying figure, a headless horseman. The following days passed more calmly. Ryou became more accustomed to hunting and cooking his catches. He also honed his magic by creating various new forms of ice. One day, he discovered the sea, but a giant crab or octopus blocked his approach. Nevertheless, his water magic power was now sharp enough to easily split stones. One night, Ryou returned to the lake where he had seen the headless figure. It turned out to be a Dullahan. Strangely, the figure was not recorded in the beginner edition of the monster book. Ryou suspected it was not an ordinary monster, or perhaps something entirely different. He dared to fight it. However, his skills were still far from adequate. Strangely, the Dullahan did not intend to kill him. Since then, Ryou regularly came to the lake every night to practice swordsmanship with it. Dullahan even gifted Ryou a special ice sword that could change its length if the blade was frozen. Time passed, and Ryou's skin darkened from sun exposure and the harsh training, until one day the killer Hawk King he had defeated before reappeared. However, this time in a far more terrifying evolved form. Its wings were filled with dark aura, its power had increased, and it also now controlled the lightning element. A fierce battle was unavoidable. Ryou drew his ice sword. The Hawk King's wind slashes could be cut with his swinging skill, yet the creature emitted a loud scream, capable of shattering his ice shield. The battle was evenly matched until finally Ryou waited for the right moment to block an attack and then thrust his sword into the Hawk King's neck. Breathing heavily, he gave a final salute to his opponent. On the way home, a dragon appeared in the sky. Ryou prepared to face death. However, the dragon did not attack him. Instead, it spoke to him. The dragon asked about the evolved killer Hawk King. Ryou felt guilty and apologized for killing its subordinate. Yet the dragon praised Ryou for his achievement. It also realized that the ice sword Ryou carried was not an ordinary ice sword, but the Fairy King's sword gifted by Dullahan. They talked at length until the sun set. Before leaving, called by its companions, the dragon introduced itself as Lewin. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the angel Mikael was at a table containing records about Ryou. He recalled something, a crucial ability he had forgotten to tell Ryou. That ability was eternal youth, a blessing that would prevent Ryou's body from aging, keeping him young as time passed. The next day, Ryou, intending to eat preserved seafood, walked toward the beach. There, he found a shipwreck destroyed by the waves. Nearby lay someone. Unfortunately, they were no longer alive. When Ryou heard a faint groan, he immediately ran closer, feeling relieved. It turned out someone had survived. The previous night, a massive storm had struck the sea. The high waves mixed with heavy rain caused a crustacean to appear and destroy the ship. The red-haired young man who survived finally awoke in Ryou's simple room. Upon stepping out to see the surroundings, he immediately encountered Ryou. The young man felt puzzled as he could not sense Ryou's presence. He also felt pity seeing Ryou's tattered clothing. Although restraining himself from sounding offensive, he politely introduced himself as Abel and thanked Ryou for the help. However, Ryou could only apologize for being unable to save the others on the ship. Abel's stomach suddenly growled. Ryou immediately invited him to eat together. During their conversation, Abel was curious why Ryou did not have proper clothing. Ryou explained that in this forest there was no cloth or thread, so he could only survive with what he had. Abel suggested buying clothes, yet he quickly realized that Ryou seemed to have no money, living far from any city. Even without nearby settlements, Ryou explained again that he truly lived alone in the forest. All the food he had came from hunting. Abel asked if Ryou used a knife, but Ryou replied that he was a water magician. His words surprised Abel, since now almost half of the central province population were magicians. In contrast, Abel himself was an ordinary human without magical powers. Abel then requested Ryou to accompany him to the beach. Along the journey, Abel asked Ryou about a magic staff. Ryou was confused, as he had never owned one before. Abel felt guilty, realizing his words had been offensive. He thought perhaps Ryou was too poor to buy a magic staff. To make amends, Abel then said that from now on he wanted to protect Ryou. Upon arriving at the beach, the corpse of the man who had lain there yesterday had disappeared. Abel paused for a moment, then felt fortunate to have been saved by Ryou. Otherwise, he might have suffered the same fate. He asked Ryou to speak casually as a friend. However, after searching for a long time, Abel did not find what he expected on the beach. He then changed his goal, requesting Ryou to accompany him to the northern city where he wanted to reunite with his friends. Ryou thought for a moment. Then he agreed on the condition that he be given time to prepare, and they must depart the next day. That night, Ryou went to Donald to bid farewell to Dullahan. He expressed gratitude for all the help and training provided and asked to be allowed to fight once more as a farewell. In that duel, although Ryou managed to push back Dullahan, he was still unable to match his master's full stamina and strength. Dullahan then walked toward the center of the lake. From the whirlpool emerged a magician's robe. a sign that Ryou was recognized as a worthy human. Ryou accepted it with deep respect, then thanked him once again before they parted. The next day, Ryou and Abel began their journey. While passing through the forest, a fierce wild boar blocked their path. Abel asked Ryou to step back and just watch, as he himself would handle it. From there, Ryou realized something important. Even without magic, humans could still fight with techniques, namely sword skills and weapon usage. After that, they continued walking. However, when they encountered a group of lizardmen in a position advantageous to the enemy, they agreed to take a detour. Unfortunately, the lizardmen had already noticed their presence and immediately attacked. This time, it was Ryou's turn to move forward, as the number of enemies was too large. Abel was astonished to see Ryou launch 4 ice spears simultaneously without a magic staff. For Abel, this was extraordinary because humans generally could only release 1 spell per magic. Yet for Ryou, it felt normal. During the journey, Abel began explaining the currency system. Ryou tried holding a bronze florin, an official currency of the Kanikli Kingdom. The kingdom's name sounded cool to Abel. He then added that besides Kanikli, there were 2 other major countries, the Dabuhi Empire and the Hadelyu Federation. However, Ryou was distracted by the name Dabuhi, which he found strange. Abel could only shake his head, considering Ryou's stranger for complaining about a country's name. Then their conversation was interrupted when a large rock suddenly floated toward them. Fortunately, Abel reacted quickly and managed to block it. Soon, surrounding rocks began to merge, forming a stone golem that immediately surrounded them. Abel attacked from the front, trying to find the creature's weakness, but the golem kept regenerating. Seeing an opportunity, Ryou tried his new technique. He created a massive icebox that fell on the golem, shattering it into pieces. Abel was genuinely shocked because ordinary humans could not create such wild spells. During their journey, they also witnessed fierce battles between wild beasts. That night, Abel told stories about the John Dungeon in the central province. Ryou, always curious about new things, immediately became eager to explore it someday. The next day, the journey continued. They were almost at their destination. They only needed to cross the mountain ahead once. However, the path grew increasingly difficult. Suddenly, a Griffony appeared there. Abel panicked and could not move. Ryou immediately threw the meat he carried to divert its attention. Abel realized the action. Spontaneously, he did the same. Fortunately, the griffin was distracted and flew away without attacking them. Unfortunately, the next challenge was far more dangerous. A wyvern blocked the path they had to pass. Abel seemed hesitant because usually it took around 20 high-level adventurers to defeat a wyvern. Even then, there was a possibility of casualties. Ryou then asked if the battle would be easier if the wyvern fought on land. Abel replied that at least it would provide a greater chance. Without hesitation, Ryou launched a rain of ice spears at the wyvern's wings. Abel, still terrified, finally moved forward to assist. In an instant, the wyvern's wings were torn, causing it to fall from the high sky. After a hard struggle, they managed to defeat the flock and collected the magic stones dropped. The green land began to appear in the distance. However, Abel still could not determine exactly where they were. Ryou felt anxious. He feared they might get lost and enter the Dabuhi Empire, or a country with a name he hated so much. Hearing that, Abel only responded with confusion and then calmed Ryou by saying they just needed to follow the path until reaching Kailati City. Upon arriving at an inn, Abel suggested Ryou register as an adventurer. With a guild card, Ryou would gain an official identity and free entry to the city. When the food they ordered arrived, Ryou was immediately surprised. Apparently, in this world there was curry, a Japanese dish he loved very much. He immediately liked the dish and made it his favorite in the Fire World. The next day, they continued their journey toward Lun City. Along the way, vast wheat fields stretched wide. A soldier on guard recognized Abel's red hair and cloak. He was astonished because the adventurer previously reported missing had returned safely without even a scratch. Their first destination was the Adventurers Guild. With Abel's recommendation, already ranked B, Ryou could be directly registered at rank E or even rank D. The base rank for adventurers starts at F and increases upward. Nevertheless, Ryou was too concerned about money, because the Wyvern magic stones they carried were extremely valuable. Inside the guild, Abel was warmly welcomed by the members. Everyone felt relieved because Abel returned safely. Ryou only gave a thin smile and chose to step out to avoid disturbing the meeting. While walking in the corridor, an elk noticed him. It seemed she recognized the clothing Ryou wore, as it was the special attire gifted by Dullahan. Moreover, it was also a symbol of recognition from the Fairy King. Elk looked very beautiful. However, having other matters, she immediately left. Shortly after, Abel approached Ryou and pulled him back inside. He introduced Ryou as his savior and a prospective new adventurer. The guild members then thanked Ryou for saving Abel. After the atmosphere calmed, Abel and Ryou approached the reception desk. Abel immediately submitted a recommendation for Ryou to enter rank D. Usually, no one ever received support from members of the Old Red Sword Party. Nevertheless, the receptionist still requested physical proof before the application could be accepted. He invited them to wait in the meeting room while summoning the guild leader. Soon after, a dignified man entered. Upon seeing Abel safe, he immediately sank into his seat, relieved. Abel then explained his purpose in bringing Ryou to Gil. The guild leader immediately approved. Yet, as the receptionist said, they still required proof of Ryou's power. Abel seriously warned the guild leader that Ryou was far stronger than himself. As proof, he handed over the magic stones from their battle. Seeing them, the guild leader was immediately shocked. He knew the magic stones originated from the Wyvern's body, a dangerous creature extremely difficult to subdue. He even panicked, as it seemed impossible for only 2 people to have defeated it. However, Abel emphasized that they had hunted it in the mountains of a dangerous region that even adventurers rarely approached. The guild leader was truly impressed. That already proved that Ryou indeed deserved rank D. Then their conversation was interrupted when a tiny girl named Lin appeared. Her reaction was the same as the guild leader's. She was both shocked and relieved. Other team members also smiled seeing Abel return safely. The guild leader gave space for the Old Red Sword members to gather. Meanwhile, he himself took Ryou to handle the registration documents. On the way, Ryou asked if he could really be accepted directly at rank D. The guild leader explained that he knew Abel's strength very well. As the Old Red Sword leader, Abel was indeed very strong. Yet it would still be impossible for him to fight a Wyvern alone. Therefore, the guild leader fully acknowledged the power that Ryou possessed. Soon after, the receptionist came to process the registration. She introduced herself as Nina. The process began with a brief interview. Since Ryou did not yet have a residence, the guild provided him a room to use for 300 days. Afterwards, he was scheduled to attend a dungeon introduction course 2 days later at 9 a.m. in the morning. The location was in the meeting room on the 3rd floor. After the interview concluded, Nina brought out a metal plate and placed it on top of a crystal. Ryou was asked to place his hand, then light appeared and engraved his information onto the plate. Now the plate officially became his guild card. After registering, Abel took Ryou to buy new clothes and a magic staff. Ryou was puzzled about why he would need a staff. Then Abel replied that a magician indeed needs a magic staff. However, Ryou claimed he could use magic even without a staff. He could even fight at close range using a sword. This, of course, surprised Abel because he had just learned that Ryou could also use a sword. That night, the guild held a party to welcome Ryou's arrival. They partied until morning. Exhausted, Ryou was finally escorted to the guild rooms and placed together with adventurers of rank F. There, he met Nils, a brown-haired man, and Edo, a blonde young man. Fortunately, the atmosphere was not awkward. Edo enthusiastically spoke with him and allowed Ryou to speak freely. Ryou felt comfortable. Edo also felt relieved because Ryou was easy to talk to. Unlike the first room, known for being cold, Tamam returned with another rank F adventurer named Amen. The 16-year-old had become an adventurer after his family passed away. Meanwhile, on the other side of the room, Lin slammed the table hard. She could not believe Abel's explanation about Ryou's abilities, which seemed impossible. Ordinary people usually could not cast long-range magic. Moreover, Ryou could create many iceboxes without running out of mana. Abel could only describe what he had seen himself, even if others found it hard to believe. Ryou then added that the only magician she knew with extraordinary abilities was an infernal magician, whose fire could burn thousands of Imperial soldiers in a single blast, destroy flocks of wyvern, and even obliterate a box with a single shout. If Abel's words were true, then Ryou had already exceeded logic. Therefore, they all agreed they did not want to make him an enemy. However, Lin worried that Ryou might one day side with the Empire. Abel firmly dismissed that concern, saying that Ryou would never side with the Dabuhi Empire just because he hated its name, which he found unpleasant. Everyone fell silent, confused, not understanding what he meant. But strangely, Abel was equally confused as they were. 8 days had passed since they had studied the basic theory about dungeons. This afternoon, the participants would begin exploring the first floor of the dungeon. Ryou briefly warned Eamon not to be too nervous so he would not tire quickly later in the day. During the question and answer session, Ryou raised his hand and asked whether the dungeon offered an instant exploration feature. The teacher explained that such a feature only existed in the Southern Province dungeon, while Lund City dungeon did not have it. Lund City itself was built as its center. Every few years, the number of monster appearances increased due to a phenomenon called a massive tidal wave. To prevent attacks, double walls were built so that monsters could not penetrate the city. Fortunately, at present, a large tidal wave was not expected. Participants were allowed to explore independently as long as they remained within sight of the entrance. Ryou and Eamon formed a team. From a distance, Ryou could already sense the aura of the dungeon creatures. Ryou would incapacitate the monsters using magic. Meanwhile, Eamon would provide covering attacks. The monsters they faced were large ants, and Ryou reminded that their weakness was at the base of the neck. With the ice spears he created, Ryou immediately incapacitated the ant. Even though scared, Eamon bravely advanced to finish it off, and Ryou clapped his hands while praising Eamon's courage. Afterwards, he immediately drew his knife to collect the magic stones from the ant's body. This success made their roommates in room 15 celebrate Ryou and Eamon's achievement, as they officially graduated the dungeon course. Eamon planned to continue exploring the dungeon. Ryou offered to accompany him because he himself intended to explore to the floors, but seeing the large ant made him feel something was strange. Suddenly, Abel appeared and explained casually that the ants were digging tunnels down to the first floor. His presence surprised the rank F adventurers. Ryou then teased Abel, saying that a veteran adventurer should not prank beginners. However, Abel replied that he only wanted to give insight so they would not worry. He even teased Ryou back, claiming he had personality issues. It turned out Abel had escaped from his teammates who had just returned from a mission. They intended to report him to Gil, but Abel went to see Ryou first. In the end, his teammates had to drag Abel so he would not escape again. The next day, Ryou and Eamon returned to the dungeon. This time, Eamon was much braver. Ryou then realized that Eamon's sword style was similar to Abel's. Eamon explained that his teacher was a former adventurer named Caro, who had studied at the capital's great sword school, and that sword style was known as the Himyum school. Eamon guessed that Ryou also understood swordsmanship. However, Ryou did not really understand, as his fighting style was original and unofficial. The next day, Ryou went to the library to study alchemy. Unfortunately, the books that interested him could not be taken home. Therefore, he intended to find a way to purchase them. Suddenly, the sky turned dark due to a solar eclipse. Ryou sensed something was wrong, and indeed, a burst of fire suddenly shot toward him. Luckily, he took cover at the right moment. Instantly, the space around him changed. He was dragged into a strange dimension. Alone with a demon. Ryou wanted to escape, but he could not find a way out. He immediately built a layer of ice walls to block the fire blast. However, the demon was so strong. With its index finger, it compressed the wind, aiming directly at Ryou's heart. Fortunately, the robe gifted by the fairy king Dullahan protected him. The demon seemed to recognize his connection with Dullahan, then drew its sword and attacked at incredible speed. Ryou struggled to defend himself. Dozens of ice spears he created failed to hit because the demon floated freely, controlling the wind. Surprised by Ryou's speed, the demon even called him a monster. However, Ryou refused recognition from a mad creature that only wanted to kill him. Although his attacks could not penetrate the demon's fire shield and stone walls, Ryou finally managed to wound the demon with a high-pressure water burst. Unfortunately, the wound quickly healed. At that moment, their swords clashed, but it sent Ryou flying. When the demon unleashed fire again, a heavy rain suddenly poured. The water droplets turned into hot steam on his skin, forcing him to cover himself with an earth shield. Though the demon laughed heartily, it realized its time was up. Before leaving, it introduced himself as Leonore Uraka. It admitted that Ryou was dangerous because he could guess its identity and promised to return stronger with the goal of killing Ryou. After that battle, Ryou returned to the real world. He found his friends being harassed by a group of students. Without much talk, Ryou knocked them down one by one, leaving only their leader. Ryou then granted passion to Ito so he could heal their friends. While they bathed together to rest, Ito noticed Ryou's shoulder wounded from Leonore's attack. He immediately healed it. However, Ryou chose to keep the details of the previous battle secret so they would not panic. Nils, Ito, and Amon explored the dungeon to search for magic stones that could be exchanged for money. Yet something was strange. Goblins appeared on the 5th floor, though they usually only appeared on deeper floors. Feeling something was wrong, Nils decided to return immediately. He recalled Abel's advice never to overexert when encountering suspicious situations. That decision proved correct. From the shadows emerged a large goblin killing someone. Meanwhile, Ryou was training alone. He wanted to become stronger to face demons. One thing he considered was how to move quickly from place to place. Though he did not have wind magic like Leonore, he tried freezing his path and then using a push of water on his back. Unfortunately, his speed was still far inferior to wind magic. Nevertheless, Ryou did not give up and decided to go to the library to learn more about demons and alchemy. In the quiet library, Lin secretly studied forbidden magic. She searched for information on water magic that could transform into a giant ice wall. However, in no book did she find it. Most likely, it was an original aura. Usually only a magician at the infernal level could perform it. Back at the Adventurers Guild, the Rank F Adventurer trio handed over the goblin magic stones and described the oddities they encountered. Nia, the receptionist, immediately reported it to the guild leader. Soon after, the guild leader summoned the first 2 Old Red Sword parties and the White Brigade. Once everyone gathered, he explained about the goblins appearing on the lower floors. The guild leader asked them to investigate further to determine whether this was a sign of a massive tidal wave or a phenomenon in which the monster population exploded. It had been 10 years since the last occurrence, and now it was highly likely to happen again. As a reward, the guild leader offered 100 gold coins as an advance and 200 gold coins after the mission. He then asked both parties to prepare by tomorrow morning. Without hesitation, both the Old Red Sword and the White Brigade agreed to the request. The next morning, Ryou woke up early and prepared to go to the library. His roommates, who had just woken up, greeted him and asked about his plans for the day. Ryou replied that he intended to look for books in the northern section of the library, which he had never visited. Then he asked back if they were going to the dungeon today. Enthusiastically, Nils nodded. However, they did not yet know that the dungeon was temporarily closed. At the same time, high-level adventurers were preparing to enter to inspect signs of a massive tidal wave. Once everyone was ready, the guild leader was about to open the dungeon door. But Abel stopped him, sensing a bad premonition. He asked Lin to use wind magic to scan the first floor. Lin cast the spell and immediately sensed hundreds of dangerous reactions around the entrance. The guild leader immediately ordered everyone to retreat, and the dungeon door was promptly closed. Soon after, a notice banning entry to the dungeon was posted at the guild. The atmosphere grew tense when an informant arrived with orders for all adventurers to join a high-priority emergency quest. The quest was to attack from the first dungeon defense wall. Meanwhile, in the library, Ryou met an elf he had seen previously outside the guild. They introduced themselves. The elf introduced herself as Sira. She asked the purpose of Ryou coming to the library. Actually, Ryou wanted to find information about demons, but he could not say so directly. Instead, he answered that he was searching for alchemy books about moving golems. Being familiar with almost all the book collections, Sira showed him the path to the shelf containing books on golems. An interesting fact emerged. Sira was the only elf in the city. Just as Abel had mentioned, she left the forest and chose to live as an adventurer. Now she felt lucky to meet Ryou. At the first defense wall, high-level adventurers were ready to face the wave of attacks. Suddenly, the dungeon door was shattered by the goblins. The guild leader ordered long-range attacks, namely arrows and fire magic, to be fired continuously. Reinforcements of regional knights arrived. However, the number of goblins this time was far greater than the previous tidal wave. A fierce battle then broke out. Abel reminded Lin to conserve mana, although he actually hoped Lin could unleash a great spell like Ryou. Ryou immediately became angry because that was impossible for him. When the arrow supplies were almost depleted, lower-ranking adventurers arrived carrying new supplies. Nils then conveyed a message from the guild leader to Abel. The party would move to the front line as soon as the large goblins appeared. And indeed, after a long fight, 3 goblin generals appeared simultaneously, a sign that the Goblin King had joined them. Abel and Pelps advanced to face the generals while their companions held back the remaining enemies. Abel managed to pierce his opponent's arm, then suddenly sensed danger from the dungeon entrance. He immediately shouted for everyone to duck. The Goblin King attacked without hesitation, even killing his own troops to strike the adventurers. Fortunately, Abel's quick reflexes saved them. Abel and Pelps immediately advanced to confront the king. The Goblin King's armor was so hard that it was difficult to penetrate. Yet, with great effort, Abel managed to thrust his sword into the king's chest. Still, the creature was not dead. Abel always entrusted the final attack to Lin. Using the perfect shadow trick, Abel deceived the king so that his friend Lin could cast a spell. Instantly, Lin's powerful magic struck the Goblin King and ended the battle. As the king fell and lay sprawled, everyone could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Ryou was surprised to see the adventurers celebrating. He did not know that a great tidal wave had just occurred that day. Unlike the adventurers who could celebrate the victory, the guild leader could not yet relax. There were still many matters to handle, especially the arrival of researchers from the royal capital, even though the dungeon was confirmed closed for a month. In the guild lobby, Nils recounted the previous battle with enthusiasm. According to him, the main hero in the battle against the goblins was Abel, who even demonstrated his perfect shadow technique, the ability to precisely evade Zer's attacks. However, Lin's attention was focused on Ryou. She asked if it was true that Ryou could create an ice wall in mid-air. Ryou casually replied that he indeed could do it, even up to a distance of about 40 meters. Lin was astonished because, in her view, such a skill was impossible for an ordinary person. She concluded that Ryou's magic was truly original. Abel, who was used to Ryou's behavior, merely gave a small smile. He knew very well that Ryou actually did not need any spells at all. Several days passed, and the F-rank adventurer trio was confused because there were no job requests. Clients had withdrawn their quests due to the dungeon closure. Meanwhile, Ryou was also struggling because he could not find mana copper seeds for his alchemy practice. He then offered a personal quest to the trio. The mission was to find magical copper seeds outside the dungeon. As a reward, he promised to pay 4 gold coins even if the yield was small. If they managed to find the magical copper ore, the payment would be 25 gold coins per seed. With one condition, they had to return safely. Considering the market price in the capital, clearly Ryou's offer was far more advantageous. The trio gladly accepted it. However, not everything went smoothly. From the inn window, Ryou noticed a group of royal knights dragging a woman into a back alley. A man tried to help her. The knight became angry, yet suddenly his steps grew heavy until he fell. Just as the situation heated up, Pelps appeared and stopped them. Initially, the knights were still arrogant, unaware that the adventurer before them was actually a royal noble. As soon as they heard the Heinlein family name of Pelps, their faces immediately turned pale. Firmly, Pelps drove them away. The man who had been saved thanked him and quickly left with the woman. Pelps glanced toward the window. He realized that Ryou had secretly frozen the iron boots on the night earlier. However, he pretended not to notice because it was clear that Ryou wanted to conceal his power. During dinner, Ryou, who usually ate with 3 others, this time sat alone. Shortly after, Abel came to eat at the same table. Ryou immediately stated that he would not treat him even though they were sitting together. Abel replied irritably that he had never expected a gift from his junior. But Ryou casually countered that seniors should be allowed to treat juniors at any time. This made Abel even more annoyed, especially because he knew Ryou was actually already wealthy, so it made no sense if he had to treat him. After a brief debate, Abel returned to the main topic. He asked Ryou to accompany him to discipline the knights who often caused trouble in the Red District. However, while passing by, Ryou noticed something suspicious. A group of adventurers he did not know acted stealthily. Ryou and Abel then followed them into a dark alley. Suddenly, they were ambushed from behind, but Ryou acted faster and incapacitated them with ice stones. From their bodies, an alchemy toolbox was found. Ryou wanted to take it, but Abel refused and kept it as evidence. After checking the ID cards, it turned out they were C-rank adventurers from the capital Handalio. On the other hand, the knights who held a grudge against Pelps tried to ambush him to kill him. However, they miscalculated. Pelps' power was so great that the knight's body burned completely, leaving no ash. Meanwhile, another problem arose for the guild leader. Researchers from the capital took the guild's food supplies and even pressured that the dungeon be reopened immediately. They also demanded protection from the adventurers, even though that was not guild obligation. A researcher named Clip confidently claimed that they had full authority from the king to conduct research and forced the guild leader to comply with their orders. However, the guild leader firmly refused the unreasonable command. The research team leader tried to mediate by suggesting that food supplies be sourced from a neighboring city. But Clip pressed again about opening the dungeon. Reluctantly, the guild leader finally agreed. However, on the condition that if anything happened to the guild's boxes or adventurers, the guild would not be responsible. Clip was clearly displeased with this decision. Meanwhile, Harold tried to find a middle ground by intending to hire highly paid adventurers. The guild leader then left the decision to the adventurers while warning them to be careful due to the dangers and after the Great Tidal Wave. The next day, Ryou visited a restaurant recommended by Abel's party members. In front of the restaurant, a little girl ran and accidentally bumped into him. The girl asked Ryou to escort her to a Red Sword member. She then handed over a letter from her teacher requesting protection while conducting an investigation. Abel immediately understood the reason behind the dungeon closure. He recalled that several years ago, a group of A-rank adventurers had entered the dungeon after the Great Wave, yet none of them returned. Before leaving, Ryou bid farewell. The girl introduced herself as Natalie. Upon hearing that name, Lin was curious whether she had ever heard of magic to create an ice wall from a distance. Natalie admitted she had never heard of it, then asked back if such magic really existed. Ria then explained that the person who escorted her earlier, Ryou, was the one who could use it. Abel then seized the opportunity to emphasize to his friends not to mess with Ryou. According to him, even if they fought together, they still wouldn't be a match for him. Abel even asked Natalie that if there was ever an emergency situation, she should entrust her safety to Ryou. 3 days later, the group had already reached the 7th floor of the dungeon. Although so far they had not encountered anything surprising, the researchers from the Royal Center seemed to be in a hurry, and Rihaya mentioned that they were working based on the theory that the tidal wave monsters originated from beneath the 38th floor. Soon after that, they discovered a mysterious gateway portal. Mana measuring devices were quickly installed. However, before any further reaction could occur, the researchers suddenly disappeared simultaneously after entering the portal.